The Year the Wolves Came, Chapter 1. I was just 10 years old that winter, the year the wolves came. We had our first snowfall of the season on my birthday. It was a thin, light fall, and lay on the ground clean and fresh and sparkling, like the white sugar frosting on the cake Mama baked and decorated with pink candles. My birthday was always extra special because my mother celebrated hers on that day, too. We had twice as many presents, 2 singings of the happy birthday song, and twice as much happiness. I never could get over my good luck on being born on Mama's birthday. Since I wanted to be exactly like her when I grew up, I figured sharing a birthday with her was a good start. I always thought my mother looked like a princess from a book of fairy tales, one of those illustrated with fragile, flowing pen drawings. She was gentle and quiet, too, the way princesses are supposed to be. I used to think that if I put a pea under her mattress that night, she would wake up bruised and sore in the morning. At local gatherings, quilting bees, and barn raisings, when Mama moved smiling and gracious among all the sun-browned, bustling farmers' wives, she looked as delicate and out of place as visiting royalty. Not many 10-year-old girls love their mothers the way I did mine, but then again, no one has ever had a mother like Mama. A few days after my 10th birthday, I found out the real reason why Mama celebrated her birthday with mine. Neither Mama nor Papa told me. I had to find it out from old Mrs. Kopek. Mrs. Kopek was our closest neighbor. Her weather-beaten frame house lay a short distance from ours, across the narrow end of her west pasture. I used to visit her often. Papa and Mrs. Kopek was a busybody, a gossip. Papa said Mrs. Kopek was a busybody, a gossip. But Mama, who always thought the best of people, said Mrs. Kopek liked to talk because she was lonely. Mr. Kopek had died a few years back, and their sons had since married and moved away. "The dear old lady needs someone to talk to," Mama would say, "and it's very neighborly of you, theirs, to visit her as often as you do." Mrs. Kopek always wore black, widow's black, to show proper grief for the death of her husband. Her dresses all looked alike to me, high-necked and buttoned down from the front, with long, tight sleeves. I think she made them from the same pattern. She must have been quite beautiful when she was young, because she's still a striking woman. She had lovely, high cheekbones and a delicately arched nose. Her eyes were a bright periwinkle blue. Her hair, although snow white, was still thick and wavy. She wore it pulled up and piled high on her head with little curls across her forehead. "That's the way Mr. Kopek liked it," she would tell me once, "so that's how I've always worn it." When I visited Mrs. Kopek, she treated me like an honored guest, like a grown-up. She'd make tea for us and serve it on her best bone china cups, with a pile of freshly baked cookies carefully arranged on the blue and white plate, and then she'd begin to talk. If Mama had known what Mrs. Kopek was telling me, she probably would have forbidden my visit. She would have said I was too young to be learning the dark, unhappy circumstances that led to Mrs. Kessler's suicide, or how Mr. Popish desperately wanted a son and was angry with his wife for failing to produce one, or all the exciting details of the Holmberg's girl recent implement with the traveling salesman. Sometimes Mrs. Kopek would get out of her chair and act out the story she was telling. She was a natural-born storyteller and could mimic about anyone. When she scrawled and spoke in a harsh, raspy voice, she sounded like Mr. Poppage, and when she fluttered her eyelashes and threw back her hand, I could almost see that boy-crazy Holmberg girl. I never knew why she decided to tell me about Mama that day. Maybe she thought I was finally old enough to know the truth, or maybe her storytelling nature got the best of her, and that was such a strange, wonderful tale she simply had to tell it. In any case, I'm sure she meant no harm. "But there," she said, "your Mama doesn't know when her real birthday is. Hasn't she ever told you she knows nothing about her past?" "No." I mumbled through a mouthful of cookies. "As far as I was concerned, Mama's past began when I was born." Mrs. Kopek sighed and leaned back in her chair. Her teacup made a musical little clink when she sat it on the saucer. Her blue eyes took a faraway expression. "It was like a fairy tale," she said. "One of those old Russians one my grandmother used to tell." "A fairy tale? Oh, tell it to me, please!" I begged. Maybe now I'd find out what I've always suspected, that Mama really was a princess. Of course. That explained everything. "It was a cold, cold winter," Mrs. Kopek began. "Your Papa had come up from Minnesota to homestead here in Canada. He was living with us until the weather grew warmer and he could build his house." I nodded quickly. I already knew this part of the story. Papa, the youngest in the family of boys, had prospects of only a small inheritance. So he left the family farm and came to North Canada, lured by promise of free land, a homestead of 160 acres. All Papa had to do was file papers for it, from the land. And it was cold? I prompted. Oh, it was terrible, said Mrs. Quebec. We had one blizzard after another. Food began to run short because we couldn't get into town for supplies. Not that there was much to be had even there, since the trains from Virginia weren't running. Nothing but blowing winds and snow day after day. The wolves had come down from the north, too hungry, and looking for passing game. She paused, remembering. I shuddered, imagining those wolves and their big sharp teeth. The way they howled at night. She made the sign of a cross on her breast. They sounded like lost souls crying to God. It made my blood run cold just to hear them. Did they do anything? They seemed to keep their distance, staying on the far side of the prairie. Maybe they found some snowshoe rabbits or some winter game out there. But we kept our barns locked and barred tightly just in case they tried to get at livestock, and of course no one rode out there at night for any reason. But where was Mama? I asked. She held up her hand and frowned. I'm coming to that. There's all will be told in due time. It was useless to hurry Mrs. Quebec when she was telling a story. I ought to know that by now. I told myself, so I took another bite of a cookie and another sip of a tea and waited. Mrs. Quebec refilled her cup, blew on the tea to cool it, and sat it down carefully, placing her spoon on the saucer, lining it up parallel with the handle of the cup. She then leaned forward across the table. Her face was now level with mine. One night, she began, her voice dropping even lower. One bitterly cold night, the three of us, Mr. Quebec, your papa, and I, were sitting around the stove, trying to keep warm. The wind was so strong, it seemed to whistle right through the walls of the house, as although they were plastered snugly. I put down the cookie I was holding and sat perfectly still. I was winding wool that night. Mr. Quebec was reading, and I think your papa was mending a harness trying to keep busy. And then our dog, Baron, who was normally friendly and gentle, stood up and growled. The hairs on his neck stood straight up. It was the strangest thing I've never seen him in such a state, and he'd been with us for nearly 10 years. He stood there, his head down, his lips pulled back from his teeth, making a rumbling sound in his throat. He seemed to be listening to something. Then, suddenly, he flung himself at the kitchen door, howling and carrying on as if he was possessed by the very devil himself. What is it? I asked Mr. Quebec. May his dear soul rest in peace. Someone or something is out there, he answered. What? What was out there? Was it a wolf? Mr. Quebec continued as though I hadn't What? I whispered. What was out there? Was it a wolf? Mrs. Quebec continued as though I hadn't interrupted. Your papa reached for the door and pulled it open. He had to fight the wind to do so, and there, on the doorstep, lay a woman dressed all in white, a beautiful snow princess of a woman. I was barely breathing now. Was it Mama? The woman. Was it? She Mama? Yes, darling, it was your Mama. Mr. Quebec raised her right hand as if taking a vow. Every word I'm saying is the God's truth. This is exactly how it happened. She had come to us through that terrible storm and lay there like a phantom on our doorstep. We had to shut Byron in the storeroom. We were afraid he might attack her. He was still crazy and excited. Then your papa carried your mother over to the fire. She was nearly frozen. At first we thought she was dead, but finally she opened her eyes, those lovely gray eyes. Did she say anything? Yes, she asked where she was. She didn't know where she was? No, she had no idea who she was either, or how she managed to find our house in the blizzard. She told us the only thing she could remember was that she had been running, and running. But she had to have come from somewhere, I insisted. That's what we thought, of course. Mrs. Quebec replied. We took her upstairs to the spare bedroom and put her to bed. I wrapped her in heated flannels with a hot water bottle at her feet, and covered her in eider-down quilts and began to spoon hot broth and tea into her. But even when she warmed up, she still couldn't remember anything about herself. Nothing? Nothing at all? Mrs. Quebec shook her head. Nothing. And to this very day she can't remember her past. I must have had an expression of disbelief on my face, because Mrs. Quebec said quickly, "Have you ever heard her speak of when she was grown up? No? Well then, you see, your papa was nearly wild to find out who she was, and if she had a husband. He had fallen very desperately in love with her, you see. The very first moment he laid eyes on her. I never seen a man so crazy in love." Papa was still crazy in love with Mama, I thought. I can tell. "So what happened next?" I asked. When the weather warmed, your papa rode to the neighboring towns and asked if they were searching for a missing woman. Were they? No. No one seemed to know anything about her. It was just though she appeared out of nowhere, like a fairy tale. Strange, wonderful things happen like that. Still happen, you know, even in these times. I couldn't reply. I sat there, chewing over Mrs. Quebec's words. Strange, she had said. Wonderful, a fairy tale, of course. Those words described my feelings about Mama perfectly. And that's how we must think of it, dearest. We will never know where your mother came from, what she was doing out there in the blizzard that night. She simply cannot remember, and to ask her about it only distress her. But it all worked out well, didn't it? I knew the rest of the story, what happened next, but Mrs. Quebec told it to me anyway. And so your papa married your mama. First you were born, then Joey, and you're all here, living happily ever after. A slight frown seized on her forehead. But what? I asked. The one thing I still can't understand is why your mama was running through the snow in her bare feet. Her bare feet? She wasn't wearing any shoes? No, her poor little feet were cut and bleeding, nearly frozen. I don't know why she wasn't wearing any shoes.